the Palo Alto Network's firewall, user ID concepts. Now we're going to start bringing things down to that user level, which is really one of the most exciting things that we have in this firewall. So relying on policies set solely by IP addresses is so 1990s. I mean, that's the way we did things traditionally, though. So that's the way everybody seems to be used to thinking about firewalls. Now, as companies grow, it's often not the clean delineation. There's really not an easy way to delineate between groups of users. So, when we first start out, I can have a certain subnet over here, and that's perfectly cool. So we'll, give this, the 1.0 network right here. And VPN users might be a 2.0 network. That's all well and good until we expand, when this network starts to override this one. So now I have the 1 network, and I have the 3 network, and all sorts of weird things start to happen. And even in here, it's not like I have, something where the first, /28 is going to be my finance guys, and then I'm going to have IT, and then I'm going to have engineers, and then I'm going to have, executives. It may start out that way, but quite honestly, it doesn't last very long, unless we do huge ranges of addresses, and even then, there's a lot of gray area for stuff. So bottom line is, we may start with a great design in mind, but not necessarily end up there. And God forbid we do any mergers or acquisitions, because then everything's out the window. Redoing an entire design after you acquire somebody sounds nice. My experience tells me really not going to happen. Yeah, I know you're looking at me kind of funny that way, but believe me, there's enough going on where everybody's throwing band-aids up, trying to get things connected to stay put and be functional, and then they'll worry about pretty later, and quite honestly, we never get around to it until we have some major event go on. So, with that part in mind, let's just go with the idea that numbering your network and subnetting your network and everything is great, and it looks really good on paper, but it doesn't always work out that way from a reality point of view. So, we kind of look this way. We've got the same boundaries that we like to draw to separate one type of user from another is no longer the same way that we do subnetting for separate addresses. We may start out that way, but it just doesn't work that way. Even this idea isn't taking into account the idea that one guy, so we have user Bob over here. And not only does he have his work PC, so he's over here on the user client network, but he also has a mobile device, so he may be VPNing in at the same time, and maybe looking at doing things on, multiple devices and bouncing back and forth between them. When you're at your desk, you do one thing. When you're wandering to the bathroom or to lunch or whatever, you do something else. We're working. That's what we do these days. So, that is just, I guess, the way that it is in today's IT world. So user ID allows us to create policies and roles based on the actual users. So concentrating on this guy right here and not necessarily having any regard for needing to know, to track, or to update specific IP addresses. It makes our life a little bit easier from that point of view. So user ID will actually gather information about the users and the groups that we use in policy creation. It also allows us to identify users by IP address, so the correct policy and enforcement of logging in there, so that way we get all that information. So we may have the 1.2.3.4 and 2.1.5.17. We may have all this stuff in here. We don't need to know that those are Bob's addresses, or worry about static DHCP or anything like that. It's really kind of obnoxious stuff. We don't need to worry about it, because user ID will correlate to that information for us. So that's kind of the cool thing with it. So we can write a policy now per user or per group based on the information that's learned from, LDAP directories, essentially. So we're getting this, methods in here, we're getting this via different ways of LDAP. So we got to learn some information to go along with it. We can also have separate policies then for known users versus unknown. So that gives us a way to kind of break things out. So a whole guest idea on there. It gives us that ability to do things. Yeah, I know you're thinking about like wireless and stuff like that. Absolutely a great way to do that. User data is going to begin to show up, in various logs and things, which makes it possible for us to sort or filter by user as well. So now I can track per user, at least go through my logging information, see exactly what things are going on. And you remember, we had the different logs. We had our normal traffic log, and we have the threat log, and the URL filtering log, and things like that. As long as we set up our policies to do user ID, then we can also track things that way. So user response pages can also be personalized in that manner. So now we can gather that information, and the page that comes back that tells you you're blocked or asks you for confirmation or things like that can actually address people by name now. So we have a little bit better viewpoint of making this a personal thing, if you will. So user ID, where can we use it? So that's kind of the cool thing. We can use it in security policies and QoS policies. We haven't really touched on that yet, but just another policy that we have the ability of controlling in there. I can use it for my policy-based forwarding, so I'll just abbreviate that PBF on here. I can use it for decryption policies. We're about to get to that in really the next set of nuggets in there. And I can do the same thing for DOS, or denial of service policies. Or profiles, I guess, is what this one is. So we have a lot of things in there to do this, and honestly less overhead for changes based on user changes or IP assignment changes or things like that. I no longer have to care. I don't need to worry about whether he's got this address or it changes to something else, or, Bob goes away and is replaced with Phil or Sue or whatever goes on. I no longer have to care. You no longer have to care. This is the important part. Yeah, okay, you're relaxing a little bit. This is good. This is a good sign. I know security is kind of one of those stressful things that as we get into it and as we start talking about it, I know I've been watching you go, oh my God, there's a lot of stuff going on here. Well, finally we have something to make our life a little easier. Now, there are two distinctly different phases in the operation of user ID. Okay? So the first phase, I suppose we'll call the phases over here. So the first phase is our user/group enumeration. And that's one of those big fancy words, by the way. It just means that I need to figure out something about what my groups are or what my users are, because once I know them, then I can have policies specific to them. So this is where I'm going to do some lookups and things and retrieve info from this LDAP infrastructure over here. Okay? So something like Active Directory or Novell's eDirectory, or even a generic LDAP server at that point. The firewall or an agent will access the directory and search through the groups. It's going to build the list that we can then go ahead and use in the policies. So we'll see that start to come in really after we configure the agent and point it for where to go and everything like that. Now, once we get to that, the firewall is going to bind to a particular point of the LDAP structure. So we need to tell it where it's going to go. It's not going to be aware of the entire thing in there. PenOS does not support OUs, so organizational units. So really we're stuck to a query within a single domain only. If you have multi-domain stuff, is not necessarily a bad thing, but you need to have more than one user ID. Okay, so we'll track this down here. So single domain per agent. And that's really kind of the important piece to know about in here. So the larger your organization, you may have more than one agent. There's nothing wrong with doing that in there, but each agent's going to be tied to a specific OU at that point. Now the second phase is where we get into user to IP mapping. And this, of course, is going to be, there's multiple ways to resolve the information, and really this is the part that goes into being used for both policy enforcement and for logging. So we've got a number of different ways to gather this information in here. And I'll go ahead and list a couple of them up here. A nice new color for it. So I have ways of gathering this. I have the Active Directory user agent. So I can do log scrubbing at that point. I have an LDAP user agent. I have Captive Portal. So that would be a web page where we force people to log in and gather information that way. What else do I have? I have a Terminal Services agent. And really I have the Palo Alto Networks client software. So that's like SSL VPN or the Global Protect stuff, and we'll talk about that in a future nugget in a little bit more detail. But those are the 5 ways that I have of gathering my user to IP mapping information in there. So as we start to look at this and kind of go through the details of it, know the 5 ways. I can tell you that there's probably a very much a likelihood that you'll be asked some sort of questions if you're going for the certifications that would revolve around methods of establishing my user to IP mapping. So it would probably be good to pay attention to those. We'll kind of keep it that way. The little small things. So that's my idea of where we're going to get started with it. Now, into the details of those methods. Let me clean this off here. All right. So as we go through, something specific like the Active Directory user agent, it's going to monitor security logs on your domain controller. It'll look for specific IDs. So we'll call it security logs. And specific IDs dealing with, things that are going on. And I honestly don't remember the log numbers, and they also vary between which version of Windows that I happen to be using. But we're going to look for the authentication ticket granted. And we've also got a service ticket, so SVC ticket granted. And then there's also I think it's called ticket granted renewed. We'll just call it renewal. Whatever the specific name for it is. But really those 3 events are the event IDs that I will look for in the security log. Now, upon the initial connection, the agent's going to read, I think it's 50,000 log entries. So the last 50,000 of them, so basically it'll build things kind of as it goes, and then of course it listens to it going forward, so it kind of sees where things are. Now, to best accomplish all this information, the AD account that the agent logs in with should be part of, and change my color here, we want to have the, so agent login should be a member of the event log readers group. Okay, so basically that way you can do event logs. Now that's good in Windows 2008 and later, by the way. If you're still running Windows 2003, there's something about managing audit and security logs or something along those lines. Basically it's an auditing type thing. So I'll say 2008 and later. So depending on what version of Windows Active Directory you've got going on. But bottom line is the user ID that you're going to use for the agent needs to be able to read the logs. That's kind of plain and simple for it. The user agent can do NetBIOS probes as well, which is a more active probing in the Windows world. NetBIOS or NBT is part of the way that Windows works. So the NetBIOS protocols. This is usually a combination of TCP and UDP depending on what thing I've got going on, but 137 through 139. Now, Catchy part with this, however, is that that's often blocked by firewalls, network or host-based ones, and it's really not very reliable in large networks. So I know, you and I for years have kind of come to despise the normal Windows probing and all the broadcasts that go around and all the other garbage that's happening on the network, and you hate it. I completely understand that. I've been trying to purge that stuff from my networks forever. It never quite seems to go away, but, whatever. At each of our entry points, we tend to block that. So while we can do this, while the agent can do this for starting to do our user to IP mapping, it's not the most reliable thing, and it's possibly something that you and I want to prevent in our security policies, so might not want to rely upon it in there. Now, the LDAP agent, by the way, the LDAP user agent, is good for Novell eDirectory and some other more generic LDAP resources. So that the Active Directory one specific to AD, and then kind of the generic one on top of that. We can use, like I said, Captive Portal as well. Everything we do in there is more passive because Captive Portal, got that over here, is for HTTP. So that kind of makes it required that we wait for some HTTP session before we're going to gather that user information. So may make it a little tricky if you think about how your user logs on and what kind of stuff they do and what order they do things in, and therefore how you're going to create your policies. Because, are you really making your user requirement that, oh, by the way, you guys, when you log in, you need to go to a web page first. I don't care what else you got going on, but we have to do web before we do anything else. I mean, I suppose it's possible, but it's kind of a strange requirement that's getting into, users not wanting to do what they're told kind of thing. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind when you're designing your policies and how we're going to gather the information. We can do Captive Portal, by the way, with cookies. That may be useful if you have an environment where your IP address changes frequently. That'll kind of keep things more refreshed and up to date. But yeah, still not necessarily the best way of doing things. Terminal Services Agent, by the way, can also be installed on either the Microsoft Terminal Server or Citrix. Right? So TS equals Microsoft or Citrix. Okay, so it gives us a little bit of variety in there. And again, map users to specific sessions that are happening on there. Users is all enabled per zone. So I will have to go into the network and the zones tab and choose whether that zone is going to have user ID enabled or not. So that's kind of the cool thing in there. Now, user agents. Okay, so if I'm writing all this stuff, user agents are all registered with the firewall. All of the information is encrypted. So we'll say, back over here to purple, agent traffic is SSL. So everything's going to be encrypted on there, which is nice. The firewall itself, by the way, can act as an agent both to the Active Directory and to other firewalls. So we can kind of spread things out that way through your infrastructure. So I don't have to go to a machine. I know you're relieved we don't have to talk to the server admins. Now, play nice. Okay, it's kind of like talking to the kids some days. Now children, we can all get along, I know. But I completely understand. It's a lot easier than waiting for somebody to test things out and decide to put it on their machine or not. Just stick it on the firewall, get it over with, whatever. Okay. So it's all good, but we can do that, or we can, deploy the agent on different devices in order to spread things out. Whatever makes sense for your environment. Also, we need to be aware, if we're putting it on the firewall, that we're going to have to make sure that we can use the information in that management profile. Remember the interface management profile where we decided what traffic was allowed to come into the interface destined for the firewall itself, and user ID information was one of those. So you might have to go back and edit your management profiles to check those boxes appropriately. Captive Portal stuff, Global Protect, those things are, the information from it anyway, is redistributed to other devices. So user agent info, specifically from a single device on that point, is not redistributed to other firewalls. So like every firewall, by the way, is specific to the other firewalls. So while captive portal information is sent from firewall to firewall to firewall, the direct agent, directly installed agent, is registered and sent only to one device. Any of my agent traffic is going to be TCP 5007. So just some information. That's the default anyway. You can always change that around, determine what you need it to do. Okay, but that's kind of the basis of where we're setting things for the agent traffic. When setting a security policy, or when selecting your security policies by that point, in order to utilize the user information, we have things. We can use stuff like kind of what we've been using so far. We can select pre-logon, which is specific to Global Protect. We'll spend some time with that in the VPN section. We can use known user, we can look at unknown, or we can select specific users or groups. Okay, so I have a lot of options that I can choose in there. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of put those out for you. So policy, I can do any pre-logon, do known user, can do unknown, and I can do select. Well, let's put that in the bracket right there. So got lots of choices in the policy as far as how I can build these things out. So kind of start thinking about that in terms of how you'd want to separate this over here and do different policies, whether it be for IT or executives or finance or, general staff or whatever your delineations happen to be. You usually build your Active Directory groups or LDAP directory groups in a specific role-based order for that reason. So it's nice that we can now apply security in the same fashion. So just to give you kind of a visual as far as where we're at for the flow of traffic in here, all of the information, whether I have authentication events from Microsoft, from Novell, from some other LDAP controller at that point, or whether I'm doing specific things to probe the clients, captive portal, Global Protect, terminal services, all feeding into here. All of the stuff, I can also look at logging information from different things going on. All of that points to what the user to IP mapping happens to be. And I suppose I should kind of group these together down here. But this then feeds information to or from, I suppose depends on how you want to look at it, about what those groups and roles happen to be. And we'll pull that from the directories. I can use all that in order to report and enforce the policies. So once I know all this information, it gives me the ability to bring it down here and to actually do something with it. So we covered quite a few things in here, all revolving around the world of user ID, and really kind of how we get that information in order to apply it to our policies. So remember, first thing we did was that user and group, what was that fancy word? That's right, enumeration. So basically figure out what things are out there. And then we had the user to IP mapping. And that really, those two things together allowed our policies to be very specific in there. So we had lots of ways that we gathered that information and good things to know about in there. I talked about some of the protocols and some of the agents and the things like that on specifically what we did to find this in order to bring it all into our policies. Policies and some profiles, I guess, too. But in ways that we can use our user information to make the security all that much better. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.